Welcome everybody to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Danielle DiMartino Booth of Quill Intelligence. Thank you so much, Danielle, for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
What do you do with Quill Intelligence? What should people know about the services you provide and otherwise?
So, the idea of an independent research firm is that you're producing research on a daily basis. We publish 8 times a week, that you're producing research that is distinct and different from anything else that you would read on the buy side or the sell side for that matter. So we try and get to areas of the economic data, areas of the financial markets, aspects of monetary policy, and bring those together and present them in a way that makes you stop and say, I hadn't thought about that. Or, Danielle's bringing real value add because she looks under the rocks that other people don't, or she's not afraid to say what a lot of people, especially on the sell side, are afraid to acknowledge in some cases.
There's a hashtag that's associated with Quill Intelligence, research revolution. What do you mean by research revolution?
Well, so we want to break all of the barriers to make one cliche even more cliched. We want to explore intersections within the financial markets, within economic data. It's exactly what I did when I was working at the Federal Reserve and advising Richard Fisher. Is I was looking at things through a completely different prism than the PhD academics who were within the Fed at the time. I have that same goal that stands today, as well as looking at things differently than my competitors or my counterparts who tend to be very traditional. And in a post-pandemic world, especially, you can't seasonally adjust backwards to several economic cycles, because the one that we've just been through has been so violent and so different and so compressed that I find it to be both amusing and irritating that so many people are looking at, gee, by the time the yield curve inverts, then there's another 24 months before we go into recession. I'm like, this playbook is not the same as the last playbook, and you have to approach data even in a revolutionary sense so that you can pull out what the real meaning is and where the economy is headed.
There's many more ways today than in the past, even in 2008, 2009, to produce data to analyze. And so how do you avoid paralysis of analysis?
Well, I think what you do is you're always looking for the next indicator that you've never heard of. Once you start to rely on a certain basket and those become your go-tos, well, sometimes they become broken. The ISM data, for example, that was done in such a way for so many years, and people came to rely on it so much that when IHS Markit, MARKIT, came around with its own manufacturing survey, that ended up capturing a whole different type of individual at companies. It ended up capturing executives' viewpoints instead of purchasing managers' viewpoints. So there was a time that you really needed to pivot and incorporate both of those viewpoints into your analysis, or you were just going to continue capturing just this one slice as opposed to a broader view of the economy. I remember when Challenger, Gray and Christmas first came out with their hiring series. Everybody's always paying attention to what their layoff data are saying, but their hiring series is so rich because it tells you what companies' appetites are for new warm bodies. And in an economy that's 71% consumption, you care about whether or not companies have demand for more labor, because that means that income in the aggregate economy are going to go up. So in a post-pandemic world, I've followed the USDA and their data on food stamps, just so many different obscure, with all this fiscal stimulus that we've had. You end up crawling down and finding out what the 9 most manufacturing or 9 most service concentrated states are in the country. You follow very closely New York Business Leaders Survey, for example, because New York is the most concentrated service industry in the country. So you try and peel the onion back one layer at a time so that you can get to true granularity, which we've really needed to provide guidance in a post-pandemic world.
You mentioned, you speak a lot about the money printing and especially food stamps as it relates to food stamps in the last 2 years, this compressed time period. Have you seen the amount of general welfare being put out there since March of 2020 skyrocket? And is that why, for instance, people are having trouble hiring workers?
Yeah, I think especially when you look at the plight of the small business owner in a post-CARES Act world, the stimulus that's gone too far has ignited inflation as it hasn't been really since the 70s, late 70s, 1980s, before a lot of people who are experiencing inflation were even alive. So there is something to be said for fiscal madness and an overreach. In January of 2022, in January of 2021, President Biden ordered the USDA to study the food assistance program. It's the SNAP program, what used to be called food stamps. And in August of last year, they announced that they were going to be increasing those benefits by 25% starting October the 1st. It just so happened to be that this was the day after the rental eviction moratorium expired. And this was the day after the supplemental federal unemployment benefits expired. And we have seen, as bad as food inflation is worldwide, and right now your food commodities index is the highest we've ever seen. As bad as food inflation is globally, it's even worse here in the United States, because we've given 42 million Americans on the receiving end of food assistance way more money than they know what to do with. So we've seen poultry and meat and egg and dairy inflation literally separate themselves from the global trend, because we poured so much fiscal stimulus onto what was already flames. And yes, you are absolutely right. It's the small business owners who in turn can't pay the wages that are required in this economy, and they lose out to the biggest big box competitors and oligopolies and the Chipotles of the world, for example.
Okay, so I think that this is a concept that maybe hasn't been spoken about enough. When you print money in order to help the poor, it leads to the devaluing of that currency or inflation, like we've seen, which then in turn, in many ways, hurts the poor the most. For one, there's going to be fewer places for them to work, and they're all going to be these big box stores ultimately. And I think that is maybe misunderstood, especially on the coasts, and to a tragic degree.
Well, it really is, because if you think about, let's call it the other Americans who are not the 42 million Americans, but think about the people right above them who are not getting any kind of food assistance, the middle class, the lower middle class, middle income earners in this country. They're being slaughtered by inflation. They're being absolutely taken out to the woodshed by rental inflation. And a lot of that was fed by Federal Reserve policy, and the Fed having such a massive footprint within the housing industry and propping up speculation in housing, that now it's tragic to read that, if you're millennials, and millennials have begun to turn 40, if you're millennials, in many ways, the window's starting to close on whether or not you can have more than one child, or move out to the suburbs, or be able to afford to save for that down payment. We're hearing more and more younger workers. These are working people here. We're hearing more and more younger people say, the rent is so big, the cost to put food on the table is so high, the cost to fill up my gas tank is nothing like I've ever seen. By the time I cover my essentials, there's no way for me to ever begin to save up for a down payment to buy a house and to kind of move up that ladder in what we used to think of being as the American dream.
What gave you the idea for Quill Intelligence?
Well, I didn't have an idea for Quill Intelligence as much as I had my best career experience working, writing briefing documents for Richard Fisher at the Federal Reserve. And it was just such a fulfilling position that I had with him, that I stepped outside the Fed, and within 5 days of when I left, I published my first weekly quill, and I haven't stopped since. And it's been almost 6 years. So I get great passion and joy from writing about economics in a different way than most people do. I'm a very good translator, and I felt that I had a lot to give back to the investing community, and I had a lot to give back in terms of financial literacy, especially with my show Down the Middle, so that we could bring in new generations of people who had a better understanding and appreciation of economics and the financial markets and how they affect them. And it's not just kind of like, I'm going to buy Bitcoin and be rich and retire when I'm 28 years old. There's more out there than that, very, very narrow lens through which a lot of young people view economics and finance, and the idea that they need to save before they can retire. These are all things these are all messages that need to be conveyed.
A main idea of there being too much money out in the system is that it leads to reckless spending. So you have an economy where instead of getting appliances fixed, people throw them out and buy new ones. Or we have them just perhaps speculating in sometimes wildly in risky assets where they would not otherwise be if the money perhaps had, if there was less money in the system generally. Can you speak to that concept at a basic level? And from there, I kind of want to talk about the foundation of your sort of economic background and education.
Sure. So we have seen that as a factor of time, that Federal Reserve monetary policy has benefited a smaller and smaller cohort of income earners. And we have to realize that American households have never had this much wealth in the stock market. Their exposure to the stock market, to risky assets, has never been higher in the history of the country. Their high-end real estate is worth more than it's ever been worth. And that's why you shouldn't be surprised when you hear Chanel come out and say, we've raised the prices of our already wildly over expensive handbags, and we haven't seen any kind of pushback. And we feel like we've got the ability, the latitude, the wherewithal to just keep raising prices because of the particular slice of the socioeconomic strata that is able to afford their products. They're making so much money based on this notion that the Fed is never going to let the markets step back. And so they're operating under what they don't believe to be a false assumption. But remember, every time since 1987, when Alan Greenspan stepped in to put a floor underneath the stock market, every subsequent episode that we've had that's followed that, the Fed has been able to ride to the rescue. The Fed was alive. And why is that? It's because we were in a falling interest rate environment and in an environment in which inflation was declining. And so I think that the current generation of investors has never seen the Federal Reserve and policymakers have to make the tough decision between, do I hike rates? Do I tighten monetary policy to get this inflation under control, under tremendous political pressure in a midterm election year that looks like it's going to be just an absolute bloodbath for the Democrat Party? So do I tighten into this to get inflation under control? Or do I look out for the wealthy one more time? And I think that the answer is much more difficult this time around, again, because inflation's not dormant. It's not sitting below the 2% level. It's north of 7%.
Who were some of your early economic minds that inspired you most? And is there a particular school that you subscribe to or enjoy reading the most?
So I have a few kind of mentors, a few sources of inspiration. I tell everybody who I can that The Lords of Finance was probably the most critical book that I've ever read, and the parallels that you can draw between the era when central bankers first came about, at least in the United States, and where the current situation is, they're just uncanny. So if The Lords of Finance is not a book that you've read, then certainly put that at the very top of your list and be prepared. Be prepared for some spooky parallels in terms of where we find ourselves today. Harvey Rosenblum was the director of research at the Federal Reserve. He became a mentor of mine. Lacey Hunt, he's a great thinker, and he started at the Dallas Federal Reserve in 1969 before I was even born. But he's also become somebody who has guided me to be as agnostic as you can about the data. Don't allow your predispositions and the conclusion that you've already made to alter the way you see the data. Be as honest as you possibly can. Be a data purist. And whenever I'm on Twitter, sometimes people are like, oh, you're just saying them. I'm like, I'm not saying anything. I'm simply communicating what the data are saying. I'm a data purist, and I like to think of myself as holding myself to that standard such that if the data change, I'm going to change with the data.
Do you like applying economic thinking to anything that's perhaps other than the economy itself? Like, for instance, in the last 20 plus years in baseball, there's been a lot of discussion about economic type thinking being applied to the game in a different way, or perhaps even science-based. Do you have a hobby along those lines that you like applying economic minded thinking to?
I don't have a specific area because everything I look at comes out in that fashion. I mean, the minute the NCAA announced that football players, that all college players were going to be able to effectively be free agents, I was like, oh, it's going to look like some serious, game theory that we're going to see, during every single season. We're going to see one player hopping from one university to another. And I'm like, the volatility of college players is going to go through the roof. If you could have a VIX index on the football season, it's just gone through the roof because of this rule change. So, but everything I look through this prism. I have 4 children, and they inevitably get into knockdown dragouts about certain things that I'm just like, let's sit down and apply this to it. But as far as a school of thought, I definitely am in the von Mises camp, in that I think, on a philosophical level, that not just here in the United States, but many places around the world, we are paying quite the price for allowing companies that should have gone out of business to stay in business by virtue of the capital markets and the junk bond markets staying open and keeping them alive, which prevents new entrants from coming into the market because there's no capacity, there's no space. So, I look at that in all things. If something goes wrong in any of my children's lives or my life, I always like to say, well, when a door is closed in life, a window is opened. Well, that applies to economics as well. And that is the very idea of creative destruction.
It's a far more, I think, tangible and fascinating idea than some of the more mechanical ways of explaining human beings, which is what economics really comes down to. Von Mises, when did you stumble upon him? And
gosh, I can't remember when I wasn't in that camp. I truly can't. I know that it had the biggest impact on me when I was inside the Federal Reserve, when quantitative easing was first introduced, because I was able to objectively sit back and watch the high yield default rate curve, which just looks like a regular bell curve. And I was able to see that rather than peaking and coming down, high yield defaults, in other words, companies going out of business and the rate at which companies are being lost in the aftermath of a massive recession, I was able to see that quantitative easing stepped in and cut the bell curve right in half and stopped a very natural process in its tracks. And we are still dealing with some of the companies that were kept in business back in 2009 and 2010. And so in terms of practicality, that was the greatest impact, I think, that von Mises and his school of thought had on me, was when I was in the front row making recommendations about policy and seeing the damage that quantitative easing was going to do a decade after the fact, which indeed we saw when the pandemic hit.
How many Austrians work at the Fed?
Oh, gosh. I mean, they might have 1 or 2 in the basement somewhere. I don't know. I think there's almost 800 PhDs in economics. I can't remember stumbling across an individual who wasn't squarely in some form of the Keynesian camp, whether they be saltwater or freshwater from the coasts or from the University of Chicago. There was still, there's an entire chapter of my book, Fed Up, called Group Stink. What's plagued the Fed for generations has been the fact that there are so few people who think differently inside of that institution.
One of the things that I like about Austrian-minded economic thinking is that it gives humans a lot more benefit and I think credit as well to be dynamic and to make responsible decisions for themselves. And I think an underlying philosophical idea there is that we're by nature social beings. So we want to be in groups. We want to identify with other people and have friends and be close to our family. And so insofar as we do act in our own self-interest, and oftentimes is in a way, or it would be expressed in a way in a free market to benefit our community generally. Any thoughts on that idea?
Well, I think that when people are able to fail and to come back from failure and to learn as life progresses, that they evolve into more productive beings. And the more productive you are, the more successful you are, the more you can eventually turn around and give back. And I've seen it in one example after another, that some of the most successful people I've had the privilege of coming across their pathways in my life, that the greater success they accrue, the more they do for those around them who have less. And I find that the best actors, if you will, are actively involved in educational type of endeavors, whether it's foster care, trying to pull a kid out of the system, out of the high school system, make sure that they get into college, or helping to establish magnet schools and charter schools. But I find that some of the most brilliant thinkers who want to give back and do give back in such a way that they can open up a pathway such that others that follow them can also realize that great success that they've had.
In the course of your reading economics textbooks, financial history books, economic history books, I'm sure that you've come across a lot of, I guess, stories. And I think that's really largely what a lot of our history is stories, and humans discussing and communicating with each other what happened. And do you take a look around your environment today and see any parallels to history or any examples of economics in real time in your own life these days?
Well, I mean, so I'm a student of the Roman era. I'm Italian. I just tend to be. And I've also studied reserve currency and the history of reserve currencies throughout time. And what's been most fascinating to me with the inequality divide widening to the extent that it has, widening to the extent that there are protests all over the world now, whether it's on the Canadian border with the United States, or whether it's in slums in a country halfway around the world. You know, I find the parallel, especially with the Roman Empire, to be telling, because it was in the end, inevitably and ultimately, inequality that brought the Romans down. And this attitude of hubris. And my greatest concern for my motherland is that there is a lack of appreciation for, so what if we just passed $30 trillion in debt? And that's not even including entitlement spending. We are the United States of America. And that type of attitude and a reckless disregard for inequality and for the roots of inequality, and how policy that is not changing has fed inequality. These are the things that bring empires down to their knees. And so I do look to history and the current backdrop that we're in today. And it does concern me. It concerns me for my children. And one day it will concern me for my grandchildren.
Crypto and commodity strategist Mike McGlone, he works at Bloomberg, made a tweet and kind of covered this idea that there's a lot of overlap between US patriotism or conservatism even and Bitcoin. The Bitcoiners come from, or rather, there's a lot of talk that the origins of Bitcoin were stooped in an Austrian-minded idea and thesis. A lot of the people that certainly latched on early on in the course of Bitcoin's history were Austrian-minded, and that is even on display today at their conference. Bitcoin 21 was last year. Bitcoin 2022 will happen this year. That is not Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin magazine. There's 12,000 people there, and it was an event coming out of the lockdown. And I went there wondering what it would be like. I had no idea. And it was very interesting to hear them with Ron Paul kicking it off, and then essentially staying on the topics that Ron Paul discussed on the monetary front, about the debt, about the issue of central bank policy. And so going in, not knowing what to expect, it was very interesting to me that they followed that sort of reasoning even today. And I think that's probably the decision of the organization that put it on, of course, but it also has been my experience on a day-to-day basis in that industry. So my question is, what are your thoughts about Bitcoin generally, especially as it relates to Mike McGlone's comments, how it could sort of be something that Bitcoin, the US should adopt rather than overregulate?
So I'm color me older than you. Let's put it that way. And it's not that I have anything against the blockchain, and it's not that I'm completely sympathetic with individuals who feel that policy trashes the dollar and purposely does so. My greatest concern is that the ownership of Bitcoin remains extraordinarily concentrated in the hands of a few. And I am a data purist. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. If you study correlations, it's quite remarkable that the NASDAQ 100 and Bitcoin, I mean, it is what it is. They move together more closely than any other asset class out there, which means that the theory is what you described. And in theory, I completely agree with you. And I'm not in favor of trashing fiat currencies. In practice, there's nothing of an inflation hedge about Bitcoin. It behaves and trades purely as a speculative asset that is as speculative as the most go-go stocks in the country, the NASDAQ 100. And I have to be objective in how I approach it, not philosophical. So, and I also go back to history one more time. Yeah, if you go back to the Roman Empire, reserve currencies have never gone peacefully into the night. It's never happened. And there is always lurking out there the prospect of another country rising up. It's happened before. So, and we don't necessarily as a country have all of the allies we would need to necessarily have on the economic stage to be able to prevail in the event that there was a country that wanted to take out the dollar and rise up and take over the role as reserve currency status, which by the way is no walk in the park. You have a lot of responsibilities with that reserve currency status, but you typically also have a good 100 years of reign in front of you, as we did when British pound sterling started its decline in the 1920s.
So two ironies come to mind: that Bitcoin itself is largely centralized amongst a few wallets. The second being that there is now talk about, and it's increasingly in the popular conscious, that there ought to be a Bitcoin standard and that it should be adopted by nations and all this stuff. However, that's, I think, also antithetical to the idea of Bitcoin itself. I think diversification is really important for individuals. And the way I've seen it expressed is that kind of be ready for anything because there's going to be so much volatility. With that in mind, I was reading something that I wrote in 2015, and it was mentioning that gold was $1,100 at the time. And now it's about $1,800 last I checked. Can you speak to gold kind of coming to life in recent months?
Well, I think you have to look at gold through two separate lenses. It is truly an inflation hedge. That is that's its historical, traditional role. And as we see true inflation percolate worldwide and wage inflation, which is the most nefarious form of inflation, we have indeed seen gold finally break out of its 2021 range where it was kind of stuck like super glue. But there's also a separate role that gold plays, and that is a word that you just mentioned, volatility. And when there is a greater element of uncertainty, then you are going to find gold's appeal increase. You can go back and even look at deflationary times, but if the market was going haywire and correlations between other asset classes were lining up, even in a deflationary environment, there was still support for gold. So if you're thinking about 2022 and 2023 as being potentially volatile times when price pressures, even if they come off their highs, when price pressures remain multiples of what's comfortable for most households, then you would think that gold would retain its status in such an environment against such a backdrop.
You mentioned you're interested in Roman history, and we saw in this country something that also happened in Rome, where the currency was devalued. There was an X amount of a certain type of metal, and eventually it tended towards cheaper metals and less of them. And we saw this happen in 1964. That was the last year where silver was minted into the currency, into the change, most of the change, not all. And I believe it was LBJ at the time who said that, don't worry, the silver is not going to go up in price. It's going to stay the same as we have seen. I believe he cited a coin shortage as to why they had to make the move, if I'm not mistaken. And we saw the opposite happen. Silver obviously increased in price. And in 2011, when I worked in a coin shop, I saw a lot of people who actually did quite well by hoarding over decades and were able to go in and turn junk silver in. Can you speak to silver either in the first in the historical context as it relates to kind of this long-term devaluation?
Well, I mean, silver's interesting, right? Because I'd be speaking out of both sides of my mouth if I didn't say silver was not intriguing when gold is, because silver has much more utility than gold does. And silver has more utility as a factor of time, like copper. Copper is increasingly being adopted for new and different uses in the world. The same can be said of silver. So you have a double benefit in holding your silver, in that you've got this true store of value. And at the same time, you also have a higher utilitarian factor that should feed and put a higher floor under silver prices to the extent it's not swarmed by speculators. But the organic need for silver is increasing as we become a more technologically astute world. And it's just a simple fact of life that we're going to be using more of it.
Last week, we saw Facebook decline by 20%, and we also saw a labor market report be released. What are the entrails of that labor market report?
So, I think the Facebook episode tells us that there is no such thing as bulletproof. And we should never view anything that is clearly overvalued as with the attitude of it's different this time, because that's effectively the thinking that was behind Facebook being as high as it was. As far as the labor report went, what was most fascinating were the revisions. So the U.S. labor pool declined by nearly 1 million over the summer months in terms of negative revisions. But in November and December, we saw upward revisions of 709,000. And that was fascinating to me, which takes us back to one of our earlier subjects. Again, the rental eviction moratorium expired on September the 30th. That forced landlords to give people 1 month of grace before they could actually evict them. So as of September the 30th, you knew that if you were behind on your rent, you needed to go out, get a job, and come current on your rent. So we saw a lot of that occur in October and November and December. And it wasn't until we had the revisions to the data that we saw this pan out. And then separately, you did get the sensation that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is really grappling with the seasonals, because we knew millions of Americans were not on the job because of Omicron. And yet we see this massive 467,000 increase in payrolls when we were only expecting 125,000. So I'm not going to get into the entrails with you. What I will tell you is that the big shocker that nobody's paying attention to is that the work week declined. And the work week fell back down to 34.5 hours. It hit a high of 39 hours earlier on. The higher the work week, the more each individual employer is working their employees, because there's this absence, there's this undersupply of labor. So you're going to work the employees you have on hand as much as you can to get as much product out of them or service out of them as you can. And I knew that once we started to see the work week itself turn, that meant that there were more people coming back into the labor force, which is exactly what we're seeing.
Well, you mentioned before we started recording that there are signs that the economy is slowing. What does that mean for all this new labor coming into the market?
Well, part of the reason the new labor is coming into the market is because the economy is slowing and because inflation has made it difficult for people who are 55 years and older. In fact, that particular cohort, they were the Great Resignation. They've been the most responsible when they've seen the greatest amount of coming back into the workforce. If you can imagine retiring early during COVID, and then this inflationary wave sweeping through your budget when you're supposed to be living on a fixed income, something doesn't work. And that's why we've seen such a big movement of early retirees moving back into the labor force. And they're seeing a slowing. We're seeing that there's been a slowdown in car sales. We're seeing inventories turn. We had a National Federation of Independent Business report show that small businesses are starting to cover the cost of carrying inventory. Well, I feel like it was just yesterday we were talking about the fact that there wasn't enough inventory out there because of the supply chain shortage. So we are seeing a shift in the narrative that suggests that the economy is more late cycle earlier than we would have guessed.
Do you anticipate the quote unquote freedom convoy exacerbating the supply chain issues?
No, and here's why. There's just not it won't have a big enough impact because there are the rails, and we have actually looked at the data, and it's disruptive, and it certainly is disruptive for the people who live in Ottawa. And I on a personal note, I think it's tragic that this kind of workers taking a stand moment and the importance of freedom of speech has been hijacked by individuals who would do such atrocious things as brandish swastikas and the yellow Star of David that the Nazis used to identify Jews during World War II. There's nothing more disheartening than a noble endeavor being hijacked by the worst form of humanity. And I think that there's a tragedy there because it's so easy for politicians to say, look, see, these are really bad people, when it really is just probably a few bad eggs.
The makeup of the mob, it's one thing when you read about it in history and you imagine what it might have been like, and then to kind of see it and recognize that it is a few bad eggs, no matter what people are out protesting for or speaking out against, it's always a few bad eggs that are kind of committing the crimes. And I think that's—
and those are the ones that the media takes photographs of. And those are the ones that go into the history books. And so you don't get a proper reflection of what the underground force was that started the movement in the first place. And that's a shame.
With the economy potentially slowing or continuing to slow, let's face it, and the Fed's candidates being up, you mentioned that people think that the Fed candidates are going to be a shoo-in, but you don't think that will be the case. Can you speak to that?
I think that there has been an extraordinary delay. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has technically been out of office since February the 5th. The fact that there wasn't a vote to confirm him with full knowledge that he has the votes. And I think that is a reflection of the fear in the Democratic Party that the other candidates that they're trying to push through are going to get pushed back. So this is an extraordinary time in US history to have this many vacancies on the board, where everybody on the Federal Reserve Board is a government employee whose email address ends in .gov, and for there to be this many vacancies is truly remarkable. And I think that there should be a greater appreciation for, if this is the difficulty that we're having getting through the Senate Banking Committee, it really could be, you really could see fireworks when the time comes and there's the actual Senate confirmation vote. Again, every day we get closer to the midterm elections.
And I guess other sovereign nations will be watching that. It is the global reserve currency. So that would be really the first time in recent memory where there could be quote unquote fireworks over such a proceeding, correct?
Well, it's certainly going to cast a negative light on the United States. The Biden administration has been uh, extraordinarily incapable or inept when it comes to filling positions. And the sheer number that are still open is reflective of a democracy that has been hobbled, of a Congress that is dysfunctional and not carrying out its duty to the constituents who elected them into office. So we are rightly on the world stage for appearing to be in a state of stasis where nothing's getting done.
I think one of the cool things I've seen play out recently are the states' rights, where there's different cultures across borders, state borders in the US, and then also the three branches of government play out. It's been fascinating watching that over the last 2 years. I want to speak about your entrepreneurial career. How has that been, being an entrepreneur?
Well, I mean, the idea that I was, after working on Wall Street and working within the strictures of a compliance department, and then dealing with what I can now call the wokeness of working inside the Federal Reserve. I mean, I knew one thing was certain, and that was that I was always going to start my own business after I had served my country for twice as many years as I had planned on. So, but the pandemic has changed my viewpoint on being a small business owner. I didn't apply for or accept any kind of a government handout or PPP loan or anything of that sort. But there was an extraordinary amount of pressure to have employees and to make sure that they were taken care of and that their families didn't go without. So it was, if there's anything about the entrepreneur in me, it's that you're forced to work harder than you've ever worked, especially if it's not just one person hanging their shingles. And I think we've seen a ton of one woman shops pop up in a post-pandemic world, so that there's not kind of a hole on your resume. So you take your three initials and all of a sudden you're such LLC. And that way your LinkedIn doesn't look like it's got a bruise on it. But actually running a firm has been a very humbling and at the same time very fulfilling activity for me, to have the responsibility of others on my shoulders. And it's made Quill Intelligence a better company. It's made our research better, and we've grown with it, which is it's very gratifying.
What are some of the challenges you faced and how did you overcome them?
Well, challenges that you face during a pandemic is effectively time. For me, at least, there weren't enough hours in the day. The data were changing so fast. We went from a crash mode to a massive recovery mode, and just following all the pieces, being able to keep up with it. It was a tremendous pull on time, as well as juggling a personal life at the same time and having children doing virtual learning inside the house. And I mean, it was borderline anarchy. And now when you have a quiet work environment, you say, wow, this is really an awesome day. I could just sit here and put my thoughts out on the keyboard, and you have a much greater appreciation for what your life is like when it's not turned upside down.
What have you learned about digital technology and how could it contribute to the economy, and how have you leveraged it in your own entrepreneurial endeavors?
So at Quill, we've been lucky from day one because we've always been a virtual company. I mean, work from home we're sprinkled across the country, Quill's employees. So this idea that COVID somehow revolutionized law firms in America, because now you can get a paralegal in Mumbai and have on one little chip an entire law library, such that you don't have to have your backup here in the United States. I understand and appreciate digitization, and it certainly made my life easier in terms of payments and back office and accounting, and the fact that everything can be done in a virtual way. But I guess I color myself fortunate because I was work from home, and Quill Intelligence was work from home before it was an acronym.
What is your approach to data on a day-to-day basis? What are some of your favorite indicators or data points, or even like timelines or time sets?
So I appreciate more than I ever have weekly series. things are in such a state of flux that sometimes waiting a month, or I'll tell you what my least favorite economic indicator is right now, and that's the JOLTS data, the jobs openings data. That comes out and Wall Street goes nuts and they talk about 11 million job openings. That data, it's 8 weeks old the time you see it. So, I give less credence to some of the longer lag time indicators that are released. And I give big props to economic opportunity, economicinsights.com. There have been some burning glass technologies. There have been some fabulous purveyors of real-time data in a post-COVID world that I now consider to be my go-tos. And I will continue looking to them on a going forward basis, instead of just saying, here's non-farm payrolls, here's the consumer price index, here's the ISM index, the big three.
What can individuals and families do today in order to, I guess, incorporate entrepreneurship into their lives and also save for the future?
So 2 things here. I was 10 years old and I thought that I had my little pretend company. So instead of a dollhouse, I would sit there at my pretend desk and have my pretend accounting ledgers. And that was probably a good thing at the time. And I am encouraged to see, because of apps and the virtual world we live in, that you don't even have to be a teenager to start your own business these days. And that's pretty incredible. And it's very stimulating, and it's great to see. As parents, I would recommend that you put on a pretend show and pay your kids compound interest for the money that they save, just so that they can get an idea of what the antiquated idea of compounded interest is in a post-QE world when the Fed keeps interest rates slammed at the zero bound. Because it's very difficult to convey the value of saving if kids don't have anything to show for it. And it's not just a matter of throw it in Amazon or throw it in a slice of Amazon and just see it go and blow and grow. You need to teach your children diversification from a young age as well. And I think one of the ways to teach children how to save first and then invest is to pay them compounded interest.
Compounding interest. So, I like to edit these into a bunch of different clips.
You're going to have to Google that one.
Got it. Great. So now, I guess, can you speak also though to now the way you've used social media in particular, because I think you're particularly adept at it. And when you post online and have a following like you, I think the most valuable thing is you learn about your followers and also people. So can you speak to, I guess, data and social media and just your experience of social media?
So, I find now that I do have the following that I have, I'm now duty bound to uphold this role that I've created for myself of being kind of, you can get a free economics degree online if you go follow Danielle on Twitter. It's not something I say tongue in cheek. I now try my very best to make sure that when I do post something, that it's got meat on the bones, and that it does have a takeaway that people can say, oh, I didn't really think about it that way, or, oh, that's good that she brought that to my attention, or, oh, nobody else is tweeting about this. As far as human nature is concerned, I have learned that the more anonymous somebody is on a social media platform, the more they tend to be irresponsible in assuming that role. So I'm very vehement about muting individuals who are spewing negativity and hatred. And because I think it's important that they not be fed any oxygen. So sometimes if there is a hater on my Twitter feed, I will go in the background if somebody's going back and forth and saying, you're giving oxygen to hatred. Don't do that. Cease and desist communication with this person, because we need fewer haters in the world. We need less on animosity in the world. And my thread, my feed is certainly not an appropriate forum, because this is where people come to learn, not where people come to get down and knock down, drag out anonymous arguments where they throw obscenities around and ad hominem attacks. But you do learn a lot about human nature on these platforms, about really amazing, good people who are so thankful and thoughtful and asking questions. And it's such a delight and pleasure to answer those questions. And you learn about individuals at the opposite end of the spectrum as well. And the best thing, again, to do with those types is just to silence them.
I often am told thank you for posting these shows, and it's a really kind comment, and it always feels good to hear that. Can you now break down, I guess, where people can get involved with Quill Intelligence?
Sure. It's very easy. As long as you can say Quill Intelligence, then you can look up quillintelligence.com. And I'm aware of the fact that our retail product, which is a monthly product or an annual product, is grossly underpriced. And I know that, and I'm fine with it. And sometimes I have arguments with sales and what have you. But I look at it as being kind of the ability to latch onto the really high caliber level of research by getting the Daily Feather in your inbox every trading day. And then we've got all the way up to QI Pro, dashboards, Bloomberg chat rooms. We have a full institutional lineup as well if you're running money. And it's a pleasure, obviously, to deal with them as well, because there is a certain back and forth with your institutional client, with your institutional client base. So, but go on quillintelligence.com. If you don't follow me on Twitter, go to @DiMartino Booth.
We've had the honor of sitting down today with Danielle DiMartino Booth. She's the founder of Quill Intelligence. Thank you so much, Danielle, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.